Welcome to Silicon Bytes, episode 5. This week we're going to start in Clown World for no other reason than I just want to get the stupidity out of the way first and as quickly as possible. We're also going to have to catch up on a number of stories, and you'll notice that a few stories we cover here are already a week or so old. That's because the planning of recent interviews has taken up a lot of time, and so we've got a bit behind on our coverage of the news. Let's kick off, though, with this one from Sky News. Russian ambassador interrupts minute's silence for Ukraine and says all lives are priceless. So this one was written by Tom Gillespie on the 24th of February. And this tense moment, this embarrassing moment for Russian diplomacy, took place at the UN Security Council as the world marked the first anniversary, the one-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion. Now, of course, a lot of the press have missed out the fact that this is not the first year of Russia's invasion. That happened in 2014. This is just a scaling up and, in fact, continuation and extension of that initial invasion. Russian diplomats embarrassed themselves with this move as the world stood to recognize the horror, the suffering, and the victims of Russia's war. That dignified moment was shattered by Russia's ambassador to the UN. And it has to be said that Russia's actions over this year, in fact, over many years, have turned its diplomats, its politicians, and its apologists into clowns. And as this was going in parallel, Ukraine's president told reporters that he would like to meet China's leader Xi Jinping, as Western nations fear Beijing will supply Russia with weapons. Now, behind the scenes, there must be a huge amount of pressure from the US and other countries on Beijing not to go all out and support Russia's military offensives. That could change the whole dynamic. It could change the whole equation and take the threat and the risk that is inherent in this war onto a totally new level. It would not necessarily mean Russia would win, but it could cost a lot more Ukrainian lives to take back their territory within their sovereign borders. Another classic piece of clownery from a State Duma member, and it has to be remembered that the Russian parliament is almost entirely consists of clowns and puppets. This particular State Duma member says that Putin has named the US as Russia's main enemy. Now, that perhaps isn't the most clownish statement. It's been clear for a long time that Putin, despite the size of his country's economy, despite its limited resources, considers itself a global power and considers itself the natural adversary and nemesis of the US. It must be galling for Putin to understand that unless he is saber-rattling, unless he is being aggressive or making nuclear threats, the US barely notices Russia's existence. This news was reported in Russian Media Monitor, and I highly recommend you look at this. It's available on Twitter, it's available on YouTube, and the fantastic team, including Julia Davis, puts together Russia state media footage and reports, and they translate it into English, making that material accessible to a wider audience. Two more incidents involving Russian diplomats, this one reported by CNN. Russian warship, go F yourself. Latvian MP invokes Ukrainian rallying cry to slam Russia at the OSCE. As I say, this was reported by CNN, but also by many other sources as well, and the Latvian delegate Rihards Kols was met with applause when he called Russia's inclusion in that forum a disgrace at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE meeting. And in fact, following that outcry, many delegates walked out. Another walkout staged, this time it was reported by DW, that meeting, which coincided with the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, OSCE delegates staged walkout during Russian address. A large number of delegates staged a walkout at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe parliamentary session in Vienna on Thursday. This was reported on February the 23rd. The session, which falls on the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has caused controversy due to the attendance of the Russian delegation. As deputy head of Russia's delegation, Vladimir Zhabarov prepared to address the meeting, a large number of those gathered stood up and left the room, while others held up Ukrainian flags. Now, I think this is the right approach. Any forum where Russian politicians, especially Lavrov and others, and you may have seen that Lavrov was laughed at during a session in India this week, this is the correct response to Russian diplomats, politicians, and any experts that are representing the Russian government. The civilized world should turn their back on them, should not engage with them, and certainly should not show all the standard courtesies of diplomacy and politics. They should be treated as the pariahs that they are until this administration is removed in Russia and the country owns up to its crimes and starts to pay reparations for Ukraine, as well as ending the aggression. Now let's look into some of the stories. And again, some of these stories will be already a week old. That means we'll have another edition of Silicon Bites in a couple of days' time to cover more recent stories. But I think some of these stories are still important and they show long-term trends, which are still highly relevant now. So this one from The Guardian, Russia-Ukraine war live. Zelensky advisor dismisses China's peace plan and warns that the window of opportunity is closing. So this is the very eloquent spokesman, Mikhail Podolyak, who has said that Russia's role as a peacemaker, this is a self-appointed role as peacemaker, is just not rational. And this view is supported by President Biden as well. Podolyak states that China's plan is unrealistic and has accused Beijing of betting on an aggressor. And if you look at the plan, it certainly rewards aggression. It rewards Russia for its actions from 2014 through to 2022. It would seem to reward Russia with huge territorial expansion of its influence, and by creating a neutralized zone across up to 1/3 of Ukraine's territory, it would create the foundations for future Russian aggression to expand into those so-called demilitarized territories. And why should Ukraine demilitarize? Why should it make itself vulnerable to a neighbor who has shown that it doesn't honor its treaties, that it is only too willing to rearm when given the opportunity, and that it resorts to aggression to support its imperialistic aims, no matter what the international community says or thinks? The next one, also from The Guardian, is a story that I absolutely love. I've been following the head of Ukrainian railways throughout this conflict, and also following the extraordinary performance of Ukrainian railways. For instance, getting the first trains running into Kherson literally hours after the liberation of that city, which is quite remarkable. This story, Rail Force One, how Ukrainian railways got Joe Biden safely to Kyiv, is obviously a week old now, but it is an absolutely fantastic story with some brilliant details in there. Alexander Kamyshin, head of the service, doesn't get much sleep, but his team coordinated the president's visit without a single leak. And you may have seen pictures of Biden on Ukrainian railways, and it's an extraordinary responsibility to transport under great secrecy the President of the United States into a war zone, into Kyiv for that meeting. Quite an extraordinary accomplishment, which they're absolutely right to be proud of. Next, we've got a couple of stories from the Financial Times. How Putin blundered into Ukraine, then doubled down. So many of these stories appeared either on the anniversary on the 24th or just before it around the 22nd and 23rd. And they go into a lot of detail, reviewing the most significant events of the last 12 months. Max Seddon, writing from Moscow, talks about the decision to invade being taken after consultation with only a tiny circle of advisors. The Russian leader has since become even more isolated as his plans have fallen apart and as the loss of men and materials has only increased. Planning for the Ukrainian invasion, says Max, was carried out by a tiny group of people hand-picked by Vladimir Putin. And whether you think NATO has a role or not, and whatever you think the causes of this war are, I think everyone would agree that the war itself, the decision to conduct war on multiple fronts against such a vast country as Ukraine, was a strategic and tactical disaster. So how did that come about? And I think the fact that Putin surrounds himself with a tiny group of people, hand-picked people, who are, to a greater or lesser extent, yes men, people who are going to tell him what he wants to hear, people who are highly unlikely to challenge him, to critique him, or to present alternative evidence to him, to challenge his strategies. That's not the system he's built. It's a vertical, and it's a nepotistic, hierarchical vertical that does not encourage people to challenge their superiors. And that is throughout the system. In some ways, it was almost inevitable that some kind of disaster would happen where Putin is relying on false and falsified information to make key strategic decisions. It's almost inevitable that that was going to result in one form of disaster or another. And there was a great piece in the BBC, and this is a video, so we're going to provide a link to it in the description, and that is titled Zelensky on Ukraine's Year of Invincibility. And if you haven't seen this video of Zelensky's speech, I absolutely recommend you to watch this video, which has been very accurately translated. So there's great subtitles in there on this video. We're going to put a link in the description, and I think it's an absolutely deeply moving speech, incredibly insightful, but it also shows what we've seen throughout these 12 months, and that is the incredible leadership and strength of Zelensky, who's shown himself to be an unmovable force. And he's represented his people who are fighting for their freedom, fighting for their land, fighting for their lives and their culture, and have become in themselves an unmovable force that Russia could not dislodge from Kyiv and will not be able to dislodge from Ukrainian lands. And then there was the vote in the UN, and you may have seen a breakdown of the result. If not, we're going to pop it up onto the screen in a second. And I think the most significant aspect of it is not who voted in support, but who abstained, because it's quite clear that Russia's invasion upsets the international order. It's quite clear it violates all the concepts of sovereign borders that have been in place since the Second World War. So countries that are abstaining are essentially sending a signal that the international order is not as important as the self-interest of their countries. Now, whether they have been victims of colonization in the past or not, countries around the world should recognize that Russia is engaging in an aggressive imperial colonialist war with genocidal overtones. That makes it even more shameful that a country like India, one of the world's largest democracies, should actually abstain in that vote. This BBC article goes on to say that India has once again abstained from voting in a UN General Assembly resolution that condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which started a year ago. The motion was backed by 141 nations, with 32 abstaining and 7, including Russia, voting against it. India reiterated its position on the invasion, saying that peaceful dialogue was the only way out. Delhi has increasingly faced pressure to take a firm stand on Russia. Many countries, including the US and Ukraine, have publicly appealed to Delhi to take a clear stand and do the right thing. But what we've been hearing on this anniversary is not just India. There have been many voices talking about peace being the only way out. And I think this war will eventually result in some kind of talks, but not while the aggressor has the upper hand, not while Putin still thinks that he can win victories on the battlefield, gain territory, and claw back some of his lost prestige. As long as he thinks there is some kind of victory still to be gained, he will throw everything at it, and he will not care for the number of lives and the amount of resource he squanders on it. It will only be when Russia is decisively beaten and Putin is decisively humiliated, he would even contemplate coming to the negotiation table and negotiating as an equal. Otherwise, he sees Ukraine as an inferior entity is not exaggerating to say that in some respects he sees Ukraine as Untermenschen. He has little enough care for his own troops and his own people, and he has even less consideration for Ukrainian lives. His thuggish mafia view of the world is one where only strength counts, and only strength demands deference. Weakness is to be challenged and attacked, and this is the behavior we've seen from Putin over and over again over the last 20 years and every single stage of this war. He will only double down and escalate if he thinks he can get away with it. Here's a short piece from The Atlantic. Blinken says Zelensky is right to demand that US does even more and does it even faster. This is an article by The Atlantic's editor-in-chief, Jeffrey Goldberg, in conversation with Secretary of State Antony Blinken. And I think the details of that are incredibly important for those like General Ben Hodges and others who have been saying right from the start of this war that if you give Ukraine what it needs in terms of armament, weapons, equipment, and training, and give it faster, then the war will end faster. It will save more Ukrainian lives. It will save more Russian lives in the end as well, and it will bring the demise of Putin that much closer, that much faster. Those who eke out the supply of weaponry, whether it's through an abundance of caution, whether it's out of fear of Russia's nuclear threats, or whether, more cynically, it is to bleed Russia to the point of weakness and collapse, it is the wrong thing to do, because it inflicts even more suffering on Ukraine, and it makes the demands on Ukraine to resist and win that much greater. And we've got two more to cover in this edition. One is from Foreign Policy. Putin still believes that Russia will prevail. This is by Ravi Agrawal, editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy. Now, this really harks back to what we were talking about a minute ago, is that as long as Putin believes he can still gain victories, that he can still get back some of his lost prestige, both domestically and on the world stage, he will continue with his aggression. So this article writes, this week marks exactly 1 year since Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered his troops to invade Ukraine. There was now little doubt that Putin failed in his initial goals. Kyiv is still standing, Ukrainians are determined to keep fighting, and the West has so far stayed resolute in its support of Ukraine. If Putin had hoped to weaken NATO, the very opposite has happened, with Finland and Sweden on the cusp of joining the alliance, with countries rearming rapidly, and with the amount of killed and injured on both sides of the war at absolutely horrific levels. Of course, we have more of an idea of the Russian dead from numerous analysis done by the BBC and other sources. The Ukrainian killed and injured is a state secret and is something which the allies supporting Ukraine have not sought to make public. And we have to remember as well that Ukraine's economy and infrastructure has been dealt a huge blow that will potentially take years, if not decades, to recover from. So this article breaks that down. It breaks down the costs of the war. It breaks down the strategic mistakes. It also points out that every single one of Putin's strategic and tactical aims in this war have actually resulted in the opposite effect: a more determined, cohesive, and united West, a West that is militarizing and rearming rapidly and will do so even more over the coming decades, countries that will be spending a far higher percentage of their GDP on defense and weaponry, and a Russia that has destroyed the illusions that it's tried to build up over many decades of huge military supremacy and might. It's been shown that that was a Potemkin facade, and that corruption and nepotism has rotted away Russia's military to a point where it is far inferior to its Soviet predecessors. If you remember Afghanistan, yes, they lost that war, but they lost a tiny fraction of the lives and the equipment that we are now seeing being lost in Ukraine by an inferior Russian army. And the last article, I think, is the most interesting one, because it points to something I've long thought about the causes of this war. And it's written by Steve Rosenberg, the Russian editor of the BBC. And he writes how Putin's fate is tied to Russia's war in Ukraine. He recalls something he had heard 3 years ago on Russian state TV. At the time, Russians were being urged to support changes to the constitution that would enable Vladimir Putin to stay in power for another 16 years. In order to persuade the public, the news anchors portrayed President Putin as a sea captain steering the good ship Russia through stormy waters of global unrest. This is a propagandistic narrative which many Russians bought into, big time. And to some extent, some of them still are, although for the more sophisticated urban elites, this narrative must be losing its power. And the idea here is that they could show the chaos and disorder brought about by economic issues in 2008 and other economic crises. They could point to Ukraine with its huge corruption and revolutions and suggest that Russia was superior because under Putin it had stability, because under Putin life expectancy was increasing and material wealth and average incomes were increasing. And that, to an extent, was true until 2012. That was true until Putin decided to extend his tenure in the Kremlin indefinitely. At that point, a fissure between him and many of the more sophisticated public started to open up. It meant that his regime had to build the machinery to control public opinion in a far more intrusive fashion. It meant that to keep the opinion polls high, he would have to take ever more radical steps to create that popularity. And for a time, that seemed to work. The invasion of Crimea was massively popular and gave a huge spike to his ratings. And this is where I think we have to look at the events of 2022, not through the prism of geopolitics, not looking at the expansion of NATO, which had been going on for a considerable amount of time, and yet which offered no direct threat to the territory of Russia itself. Much bigger threats were the storm clouds locally, the return of Navalny to Russia, the increasing effectiveness of the opposition at creating campaigns and producing videos that were wildly popular that showed Putin as a kleptocrat, a petty thief, taking the wealth of Russia and imposing a system of corruption and kleptocracy to enable him to thieve on a grand scale. This, I think, is the root of the war. Putin had to create a grand gesture, a small victorious war, another Crimea, to give himself a boost in popularity and to cement his position ahead of presidential elections in 2024. Steve Rosenberg writes, Russia is an oasis of stability, a safe harbor, said that TV anchor from 3 years ago. If it wasn't for Putin, what would have become of us? Well, so much for that oasis of stability and safe harbor. That ship was decisively sunk in 2022. And the Kremlin set out to sail on a storm of its own making. The article goes on to question whether Putin is actually now heading for an iceberg, to continue that sort of nautical theme. And it also wonders what will happen in those 2024 elections, because as we know, Putin is appearing less and less in public. He cancelled his appearance at Valdai, the public forum this year. The Kremlin bunker boy does not seem in a fit state to go through a full public election process with potentially a disastrous loss in war as a background to that campaign. The well-known political scientist Ekaterina Shulman writes, 2 years before the 2024 vote, the Kremlin wanted some victorious event in 2022 that would help them to achieve their objectives. They calculated that in 2023, that small victorious war would still instill in the minds of Russians how fortunate they were to have such a competent captain steering the ship, not just through troubled waters, but bringing them back out on the other side into a new and richer economy. Then in 2024, people would vote. Bingo, what could go wrong? Well, plenty, if your plans are based on misassumptions and miscalculations. And I think that is the critical point, again, tying up the stories you mentioned earlier. the power vertical that Putin has created, the hierarchical kleptocratic system where he is surrounded by yes men, surrounded by people who'll give him the answers he wants to hear. Answers based on his own prejudices, answers based on the mythologies he's built in his mind, answers based on fantasies that he has concocted while isolated and alone in his bunker through COVID and now through this war. Russian opposition and other commentators are now starting to say that they think Putin has gone mad, driven mad by power, driven mad by being in control of the Kremlin. From prison, Ilya Yashin this week got a message out via his lawyers saying exactly that. So can you negotiate with a madman? Can you negotiate with someone who has lost touch with reality? I would argue you cannot. And India, China need to wake up to who their partner is in this process. He is a genocidal autocrat for whom no amount of blood and terror will be enough until he achieves his delusional aims. Well, we end this episode on that rather depressing note. Do please tune in later this week when we will have Silicon Bites Edition 6, and we'll be looking at stories from, amongst others, the Moscow Times, Financial Times, and Economist about all the latest events in Ukraine. And we will also take a deep dive into Alexei Navalny's recent statements about Russian imperialism and what should be done about Crimea.